Welcome everybody to our first event at the Center for European Studies this academic year, 2021, I guess it is, that we're finally here. I am the new director of the Center for European Studies. I have taken over from the extraordinary Belinda Davis, who has set quite a remarkable example. So I'm looking forward to living up to it. We are mostly online this semester because of transition issues with the pandemic. We're hoping to be fully back in the spring, and also because of some of the complexities that we've had to deal with around the flooding. We are going to be hosting a number of very exciting events. The next one coming up is the Afghanistan Roundtable on Monday and the 20th. And then right after that, on the 29th, is the Germany after Merkel Roundtable. We will also be co-hosting an event on September 22nd with Ata Quason and Mara Di Gennaro about Mara's new book on global modernism. So I will keep sending out those announcements and blasts. Today's lecture is part of our Colonialism, Interwar Europe, and Archeopolitics collaboration. The center has undertaken this with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Hellenic Studies Program at Simon Fraser University, and the Art and Archaeology Division at the National and Kapodistrian University at Athens. My fellow collaborators are all here, although Faisal is not here in vision, or rather in image. He is here, I think, in spirit. Are Dmitry Splanzos, Director of the Center for Hellenic Studies at SFU, Irini Kotsavili, also at SFU, a professor there, Dmitry Splanzos, I think, what is it, director of the Art and Archaeology Division and ace archaeologist in Athens at the National and Kapodistrian University, and Faisal Devji, historian of South Asia and professor at Oxford. And I think also heading the South Asia Center, Faisal, I'm not sure, but I don't want to make mistakes by canceling other people's leadership roles and installing my friends. So it's thrilling to be part of this group. We're hoping to be hosting on October 21st, another event for this here at the center. We will be having a workshop in Athens, which we will be announcing to, at least in theory, it will be in Athens, but we don't know yet what the travel plans will be. I am going to now turn this over to Dmitry Splanzos, who is going to introduce our speaker and sort of announce the protocols of how we're going to proceed today. Thank you very much, Dmitry, for both the Dmitrys for joining us, and everybody else and our attendees. Please do jump in with questions at the end, and also reach out to us, and you can put it in chat if you want to be part of our mailing list and are not already, for our announcements. All right, Dmitry, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Sadia, so much. Good evening from Athens. My name is Dmitry Splanzos, and as director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University, I'm delighted to be collaborating with the Rutgers Center for European Studies and the Archaeology and Art History Division of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens on the Colonialism, Interwar Europe, and Archeopolitics series. Tonight, or as the case may be, day in North America, I'm delighted to introduce the inaugural speaker for our series, Dr. Dmitry Splanzos, who's professor of classical archaeology at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. which is also my alma mater. So Dr. Splanzos specializes in Greek art and archaeology, archaeological theory, and contemporary and modern receptions of classical culture. Graduating with a BA in History and Archaeology from Athens, he received his MPhil and DPhil in Classical Archaeology from the University of Oxford. After postdoctoral and curatorial work, Dr. Splanzos taught at the University of Ioannina before joining the National Kapodisian University in Athens. His many monographs and edited volumes have been published in the UK, Greece, and the US, and his contributions are both specialized but also directed to audiences of students and laypersons, a direct testament to Dr. Splanzos' role as an academic researcher, educator, and public intellectual. Writing aside, Dr. Splanzos is an active field archaeologist and co-director of the Argos Restikon excavation project. In recent years, he has been actively participating in public discussions regarding the role of archaeology in contemporary societies, as well as the uses of the classical past in nationalism, post-colonial thinking, and modern and postmodern governmentality. His paper today, titled Archeopolitics, the Second Life of Statues, fits within this very rubric and will, to put it as succinctly as possible, be discussing ways in which ancient statues tend to become entangled in contemporary political agendas. Before I cede the digital floor to Dimitris, let me offer a note on procedure. First off, please note that this is a recorded session and that will be available for viewing at a later stage. Furthermore, once the talk is completed, we will open the floor to questions. For purposes of efficiency, we ask you to submit your questions on the Zoom chat box. In my capacity as moderator, I will be monitoring those questions and will read them to Dr. Splanzos, who will in turn address them. That being said, let me pass the floor to Dr. Splanzos. Hello.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Sadia, and thank you, Rutgers. Thank you for the hospitality today. It's very exciting indeed to inaugurate this series, and I do hope we all get to meet in Athens in January. So let me start with a rather recent example, a case study. On June 7, 2020, only last year, a crowd of demonstrators pulled down from its pedestal in the heart of the English city of Bristol the bronze statue of Edward Colston, defaced it in red and blue paint, rolled it down the seafront and threw it into the harbor. We probably all remember this. 10 days or so later in Washington, D.C., a different crowd of protesters attacked the equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson, the American statesman and army general who went on to become the 7th president of the United States. The two events, seemingly unrelated, were clearly linked to the global wave of protests following the murder of George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, by two policemen in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Several similar incidents of statues of great men being defaced, destroyed, or otherwise degraded took place across the world during that time of unrest. What triggered these attacks was a generalized sense of anger against the ideologies and acts those statues represented. Colston, long celebrated as one of England's great philanthropists, has also been exposed as a slave trader, and Jackson was a slave owner whose plantations prospered through cotton trade. Edward Ward Carmack, shown here, was a lawmaker and newspaper editor in Nashville and Memphis in the early 1900s, who endorsed the lynching of 3 Black men who were trying to open the grocery store. In the eyes of the destroyers, these seemingly innocent works of public art appeared as ideological powerhouses, to use the phrase coined by Verity Platt. Their artfully executed bodies of bronze or marble were found to compress entire systems of authority diffused through the social system by a ruling class disguised as a benevolent band of merry art lovers. What comes across with such actions of public violence is a strong political message penetrating our present field of vision. We all by now understand that the past materialities we theorize, consume, and recycle as art may, and most commonly are, used as carriers and generators of political meanings in and about the present. And although monuments like the statues showing here have long been recognized as agents of a state-driven politics of memory, we need to work quite a bit more on the strategies and the templates, the gestures, the performances such politics entails. This deeply biopolitical strategy of allowing the past to inform and regulate the present, I call archeopolitics. Not so much in the sense of a politically driven or burdened archaeology, which is the sort of use most common now, but more with an archaeologically configured politics in mind. So not so much as in a sense of an archaeology that becomes political, but in a sense of a politics that becomes archaeological. For if monuments like the three bronze statues mentioned here need to be edited in order to reflect our present resolution to form a society more just, more inclusive, less censored than the societies we inherited from the 19th and the 20th century, then so does our relationship with the past, and its material remains at large. Our collective archaeophilia, it would seem to me, our apparently shared drive to live our present through constant archaeologies of the past, has enabled these systematic employments of politics of a life, a bios that presents itself as an abiosis more often than not, or than it should. What I will be arguing today is that through repetitive performances of a seemingly inherent love of things ancient, we, as bodies, as communities, as national subjects, as supranational congregations, or cyber citizens inhabiting fast emerging global escapes, have learned to adapt to the authoritarian archeopolitics of our present, or often enough, deploy our own archeopolitics. This drive I shall call archaeomentality later on. That is the management of life and living as an archaeolatric ritual taken to its extreme, even if this means a politics of death and of dying. A politics that, in its negation of life, ends up disavowing the very past it is supposed to venerate. But let me revert to the examples I have promised you in my abstract. Let's go back to July 1939. It is the 11th of July, and a bizarre ceremony is taking place in the seaside town of Tarragona in northeastern Spain. Gian Galeazzo Ciano, second Count of Cortellazzo and Bucari, and Italy's Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, was received by Serrano Suñer, a Spanish Minister of the Interior, for the public unveiling of a statue of Roman Emperor Augustus. The effigy of the long-dead monarch was made all'antica as a replica of the well-known Prima Porta type, if there are any archaeologists in the group. The two dignitaries entered the town by car, receiving the enthusiastic welcome by the cheering public. They were driven through streets adorned with fake Roman columns and arches decorated with Spanish and Italian flags, sprinkled with Latin slogans praising the glory of Rome, ancient and modern. They then walked through the town's so-called archaeological promenade, and the Italian minister unveiled the statue, which was covered with a Spanish flag. Then came speeches by the two men musing over the Roman identity, Integridad Romana, and the imperial greatness, Grandeza Imperial, of the two countries. Spanish daily La Vanguardia described the whole affair as a triumphal tour excursion triomphale, also alluding to the ceremony's Roman genealogy. Let me just state here that I owe this information and references to the press and movie clips from the time to Vasilis Balaskas, a PhD student of mine with whom we will be soon publishing these documents in a joint paper on fascism and the spectacular. Now, Ciano and Sunier served under Europe's most prominent fascist dictators of the 20th century, Mussolini and Franco. Central to the day's proceedings, as well as to the two countries' rapprochement following a period of distrust, while Spain was under Democrat rule, was the idea of Romanità, a concept introduced to modern politics by Mussolini himself. Italian nationalism often turned to Italy's Roman heritage from 1870 onwards. It is, however, with the Ventennio Fascista, the 20-year fascist rule starting with Mussolini's rise to power in 1925, that the idea of Romanità, from the Latin Romanitas or Romanness, became a central issue in current politics. As has been observed by scholars studying Mussolini's own ties with Roman antiquity and the idea of Romanità in particular, fascism was, of course, a modern ideology looking at the future. At the same time, however, looking back at an idealized Roman past, a field of tension, in the words of Jan Nellis, that provided fascism with much of its dynamic as well as its attraction. The ceremony attended by Ciano and Sunier that sunny day in July 1939 was one of a number of occasions where Roman relics were exchanged between fascist Italy and Spain before and after the establishment of Franco's regime. As such, this ceremony displays many of the characteristics I would assign to what I understand as archeopolitics. That is a public discourse that is both political and archaeological, in that it feeds off a collective desire for the materialities of the past in order to usher a new sort of political technologies into the present. Archeopolitics, therefore, is an acculturated form of biopolitics assimilated into discourses of the past rather than the present or the future. As described by Michel Foucault, biopower is the practice of modern nation states to regulate their subjects through the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations. Biopower is enforced through biopolitics, according to Foucault and other thinkers, which is understood as an extensive toolkit of strategies and mechanisms through which human life processes are managed under regimes of authority. In other words, biopolitics is the process by which biopower is exerted and life is managed with the aim to achieve equilibrium through state-regulated mechanisms. Whereas these control mechanisms and modes of intervention are ostensibly there to maintain life, such as massive vaccination, for example, which is very much a thing of the present right now, they do so through the loss of life, or at least through the designation of certain lives as unworthy of maintaining. In archeopolitics, on the other hand, control over life, I think, is disguised as a noble kind of love of things ancient, what in Greek we call archeophilia, an aspiration to a higher life model that is not imposed to anyone, but ought to be inherently felt by everyone. We're all supposed to love antiquity. As a result, whereas biopolitics strives to organize entire populations according to a newly set disciplinary and regulatory economy, archeopolitics mobilizes archeophile sentiments in order to manage life in the present. And as the examples discussed here will show, archeopolitics is effective because it is at the same time corporeal and performative. And we saw that in Spain, and we see some more of it later on. like biopolitics, archeopolitics affects, informs, and enables modern technologies of governmentality, that is, the organized practices through which subjects are governed, a concept to which I will return below. Now, through the deployment of classical antiquity as a biotemplate, these public gestures of archaeophilia were meant to inscribe Mussolini and Franco's fascist notions of empire onto their ever-ready, always available populations, to a global mass, to paraphrase Foucault, who had been habituated into accepting the authority of classical antiquity as an archetype in their present condition. An archetype, to be sure, confirming the ruler's right not only to make live, but also to let die. Foucauldian biopolitics, therefore, is not merely about sovereignty and the ruler's ability to govern through the disciplining and punishing of his or her subjects. By exercising its biopower as power over life, this particularly modern form of government redefines the national population and reframes politics itself through both mapping the nation and sorting the bodies of its citizens. For if a nation's sovereignty is all about maps and the cartographic consummation of the nation's primeval ties with its ancestral land, modern biopolitics is principally and explicitly about sorting the bodies of its population into those that belong and those that do not. By transferring classical Rome's biopower into Spain and Italy's interwar realities, therefore, the two dictators imbue fascist ideas with the allure of a coveted Romanitas, thus reinventing Romanitas as a fascist ideal. Those among the population who espouse the fascist ideals are the true Romans, therefore belong to the nation. Everybody else does not belong, therefore their bodies may be sorted away. And it should be added that for all intents and purposes, the version of antiquity the two dictators chose to promote, as is always the case with the sort of antiquity promoted by archaeopolitics, was a thoroughly imagined one. It is this notion of a shared classicality among an assortment of other versions of patriotism that would turn the subjects into a well-organized mass of disposable bodies, happy to be made live as modern versions of their imagined classical selves, or if it should come to that, to be let die. Now, in the remainder of this paper, I will be turning to the 21st century and the case study of contemporary Greece in order further to explore archaeopolitics in its current manifestations. I shall continue with the theme of classicizing statuary and its corporeality as a means to claim national space, negotiate historical time, and in effect express political identities, be they already established or still in the making. April 19, 2019, a bronze statue of Alexander the Great showing the Greek conqueror as a teenager was unveiled in central Athens. George Kaminis, mayor of Athens at the time, on whose initiative the unveiling had been organized, stated at the ceremony that the cultural heritage of Athens is now enriched even further by the addition of the statue in a central spot of the Greek capital. Adding that by showing the long-gone king as a boy, the work avoided any militaristic symbolism. This was all part of the press release that day. The statue itself, a rather mediocre variation on a well-known classical type, was the work of Greek modernist sculptor Yannis Papas, who had died in 2005, many of whose other creations, mostly effigies of Greek politicians from the 19th and the 19th and the 20th centuries, they're all men, sort of great Greek men, persistently adorned the city's parks and squares, Venizelos, Trikoupis, and others. According to the mayor's press release, Papas had donated his work to the Greek Ministry of Culture in the 1990s, who then passed it on to the municipality. There, it apparently lay forgotten until it was retrieved by Kaminis, resurrected to be planted in one of Athens's most central locations. Now, the timing of the statue's sudden resurrection and hasty unveiling was crucial. Kaminis' term of office was about to end less than 4 weeks after the unveiling, as municipal elections had already been called for the following May, to coincide with that year's European Parliament elections, for which Kaminis was a candidate for an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, but failed to get elected. Nevertheless, Kaminis ran for office once again for the July 2019 snap national election, where he was appointed to the sole state deputy seat won by his party, Kinal. Kinal means Movement for Change. Now, Kinal, a recent mutation of Andreas Papandreou's Pan-Hellenic Socialist movement, known as PASOK, from the 1970s, had lost most of its electoral grasp in the years following the 2009 Greek bailout and subsequent economic recession. In the political turmoil that followed Greece's financial collapse, the socialists found themselves in forced collaboration with the erstwhile arch enemies, the center to ultra-right wingers of the New Democracy Party, with whom they formed a series of coalition governments between 2012 and 2015. The unprecedented victory of Syriza, that is coalition of the radical left, in early 2015, sent both the conservatives and the socialists to the opposition, where they worked hard and in unison against their new common enemy. A loose political coalition was thus formed, aided by the onslaught of the Greek crisis. The conviction was forcibly neoconservative, professing a deep disregard for the left and its policies, which they dubbed populist tout court, and a vehement reaction to any sort of political radicalism in favor of an imagined social and cultural elite, of which they posed as the self-appointed leaders. In short, what Tariq Ali has acutely described as the extreme center. And, surprising as it may sound, Kaminis' sudden inspiration to burden his city's cultural horizon with a classicizing statue of Alexander the Great in the penultimate month of his 8 years in office was little more than an archeopolitical gesture devised to enhance his party's anti-government rhetoric. Now, how can a statue of a long-gone king be considered political, you may ask, and why should we suspect Alexander the Great of anti-leftist sentiments more than 2300 years after his death? The answer is to be found in the recent, at the time, rapprochement between Greece, led by Syriza and its leader, Alexis Tsipras, with what at the time was the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, FYROM in short, or simply Macedonia for its friends. As most of our audience today most likely still remembers, Greece had maintained a hardcore stance against the emerging new state back in the 1990s and in the aftermath of the Bosnia War, arguing that the name of Macedonia belongs solely to Greece owing to its antiquity. A sudden surge of Macedonian archaeology took Greek public imagination by storm, aided by a series of important archaeological discoveries from the 1970s and the 1980s that brought to light what most scholars believe to be the royal necropolis of Ege, lying in the vicinity of present-day Vergina, a small town securely situated within the Greek borders. These archaeological discoveries gave everyone in Greece, scholars, state officials, and the general public alike, a legitimate reason to celebrate archaeology, and in the face of Manolis Andronikos, Vergina's excavator, to honor historical commitment to research as a way of revealing the nation's true origins. Images of the Vergina artifacts were claimed by the national imaginary as symbols of Greekness, which somewhat vaguely was as a rule taken to be synonymous with Macedonianness. Must be pointed out, however, that the fledgling republic on the other side of the border had a significant part to play in Greece's sudden archaeopolitical hysteria. For Greece's northern neighbors also got their eyes set on Vergina and its gold-packed tombs, hiding the royal remains of Alexander's father and stepmother, and also his grandmother, his son, and perhaps his stepbrother as well. The good thing with this sort of speculative archaeology is that the sky is the limit. Archaeology helped both sides frame their demands as well as question their opponent's legitimacy in theirs. As far as archaeopolitics goes, however, the Macedonian dispute evolved into far more than a mere quarrel over ancient art and its symbolisms, classical or modern. Fast forward 2019. Following months of a new series of negotiations, Greece's left-wing government struck a long overdue pact with Fyrom, which from then on was to be referred to as the Republic of North Macedonia, a name that in itself suggests that there's also a South Macedonia territory that once belonged to the ancient kingdom of Macedon, but now is part of the Greek state. Although the new treaty was internationally greeted as a considerable breakthrough, significantly contributing to maintaining the peace in the area, on the national front, political opposition to the Syriza government remained unconvinced. Despite their centrist facades, both the New Democracy and Kinal parties rallied their supporters against the treaty, turning to their innermost nationalist feelings. As the treaty entered its final ratification stages during the last months of Syriza's term in government in early 2019, its opponents saw fit to use, if not reignite, a widespread nationalist sentiment in Greece as a weapon against the governing left and Alexis Tsipras in person. A number of passionate and sometimes violent rallies were organized in Athens, Thessaloniki, and other Greek towns in the early months of 2019, attacking the agreement and those who made it happen, claiming the deal was treasonous for Greek geopolitical interests. As it was to be expected, Macedonian archaeology was once again deployed as a political argument, as well as a means to forge a militantly xenophobic ethnic identity. Images of Macedonian artifacts were often included in the iconography of the rallies, and often enough protesters came dressed as ancient Macedonians, a gesture surviving or indeed revived from the 1990s. Admittedly, Thessaloniki provided a better scenery for such protests than Athens. Since the mid-1970s, the city has housed on its famous seafront a spectacularly displayed bronze Alexander, shown here, to which a lesser statue of his father Philip was added in the early 1990s, when the dispute over Macedonia's name was breaking out. In true archaeopolitical fashion, the discovery of the tomb was taken to confirm Macedonia's Hellenicity, and this, even if historically speaking, the discovery did not affect our understanding of Macedonian history, because when it comes to Philip's death, we happen to know precisely when, where, and how he died, and excavated his cremated remains in Vergina's tomb too, or elsewhere, would not add much to the information we already possess. It would just confirm that he's also, indeed dead. Further, the actual political dispute between Greece and the then Fyrom was pretty much an unsettled record from the 19th century and had nothing to do with Alexander and the tomb supposed to belong to his father. The two statues, therefore, were erected in Thessaloniki not as historical landmarks alluding to the city's antiquity, but as visual reminders of the city's and indeed the nation's at large struggle against those threatening its present by questioning its past. It is certainly no coincidence that the awkward placement of Philip's statue on a random crossroads in downtown Thessaloniki, doing very little to highlight the work's artistic value such as it is, seems only to be explained in view of the city's archaeological museum standing nearby, where at the time of the statue's erection, the spectacular finds from Vergina were still exhibited before the move to the museum on the site in Vergina itself. Thessaloniki and the Greek side at large was not alone in this slyly improvised game of archaeopolitics. North Macedonia, or simply Macedonia, as everyone insisted on calling the former Yugoslavian statelet back then, despite Greek protests, based a great share of its diplomatic effort between the early 1990s and the late 2010s on archaeological imagery. In this, North Macedonians were quick to learn from the best, that is, the Greek opponents, and very soon a rivaling Macedonian archaeology emerged on the other side of Greece's northern borders, copying the strengths of the original as well as some of its most fundamental flaws. The so-called Skopje 2014 project, named after North Macedonia's capital, is a case in point. Devised around 2010 by Nikola Gruevski, the country's long-serving prime minister between 2006 and 2016, the endeavor was meant to affirm North Macedonia's national identity by means of a thorough reimagining of the city's public space open to the international gaze, tourist or other. This involved a widespread antiquization of North Macedonian urban landscape with an emphasis on classical antiquity, though considerable effort was made to include every period of Macedonian history into a hegemonic, seamlessly continuous and ethnically cleansed national narrative following the example of everybody else in the Balkans and notably Greece. The centerpiece of the project was once again a statue all'antica, modeled on Alexander's statuary from the Hellenistic period, even though the authorities at Skopje were careful enough not to identify the monument with the conqueror's name. Coyly dubbed warrior on a horse, the 22-meter-high statue shows an Alexander look-alike ancient Greek or indeed Macedonian horseman on a thick pillar copying Roman artifacts of the imperial period, most notably the Trajan column. As a collection of already outdated copies of European elsewheres, as acutely described by two of its most eloquent critics, Andrew Gran and Alexander Tchaikovsky, Skopje 2014 organizes its audience according to a template both exceptionalist and exclusionary. Passers-by, locals and visitors alike, are treated with a canonized version of North Macedonian history, facilitated through aesthetic and cultural paradigms borrowed from elsewhere, mostly European neoclassicism. An ironic consequence of this persistent copying is that the version of North Macedonian identity forged by Skopje 2014 is one virtually unrecognized in North Macedonia itself, where the majority of those surveyed identify the 19th century as their nation's most defining moment and not classical antiquity. A close study of the blood affair between Greece and North Macedonia in their 30-year dispute over the name shows it to be archeopolitical in nature. Through an intensive antiquization of public space, material or intellectual, the two countries managed to cleanse the populations as well in true biopolitical fashion. Nationhood is thus restricted to those who can claim to be the sons and daughters of the ancients, at the exception of everybody else, who is thus turned into a lesser citizen or even a non-citizen. This is most evident in North Macedonia, where ethnic tensions between the Macedonian, the Albanian, and other minorities are still boiling. So in the last few minutes, I attempted a quick survey of the cultural and political phenomenon I have called Macedonian archaeology. That is the existential need felt by Greeks and North Macedonians to claim archaeological imageries from a shared and largely imagined classical past in order to assert political benefits at the present. I did this in order to show that this frantic repurposing of public space and the public sphere at large is both crypto-colonialist in the sense explained by Michael Hertzfeld and biopolitical, which is the deeper meaning of archeopolitics, that is both crypto-colonialist and biopolitical. On the one hand, both Greeks and North Macedonians feel compelled to adopt for themselves a cultural iconography invented by others, specifically in order to define and, in a sense, discipline the two countries. This is crypto-colonialism. And on the other, both communities resort to archaeology in order both to map their nation as well as sort themselves and others. This is archeopolitics. As a result, this systematic repurposing of public sentiment over the classical past and its reenacted materialities affects not only the states we all live in, but also the ways in which we live in them, as minds as well as bodies. So this is the notion I have already introduced as archaeomentality based on Foucault's idea of governmentality, that is the organized practices through which subjects are governed. I argue that like biopolitics, archeopolitics affect, inform, and enable modern technologies of governmentality. I will also argue that the archeopolitical management of current affairs in Greece or anywhere else in the world for that matter, leads to the emergence of a unique sort of governmentality, an archeomentality, so to speak. Governmentality is the art of government. That is the governmental rationale behind techniques and mechanisms of population surveillance, the invention and control of the self, biopower, and biopolitics. In other words, present-day governmentality preoccupies itself with social and scientific engineering, effected through the deployment of everyday technologies of the self. Archeomentality, on the other hand, may be termed the governmental rationale, effected through the prioritization of antiquity over the present, assuming that the love of things ancient is inherent in modern national populations. Archaeological regimes thus become encoded into social practices as well as everyday gestures across the nation. Through the enforced naturalness of archaeopolitics, human subjects are gradually taught to comply with subtle regulations and expectations of the social order, from austerity measures to biopolitical sorting within and without the nation state. And this leads me to the concept of biopolitical sorting, which I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, and I find particularly useful in my discussion of archaeopolitics. For Foucault, the biopolitical moment is when biopower inscribes racism in the mechanisms of the state. Racism, which of course predates the emergence of biopower, becomes through biopolitics the basic mechanism of power as exercised in modernity. Racist technologies, Foucault observed, introduce a break into the domain of life that lies under the control of the state, a break in the biological continuum of the human race, a hierarchical distinction between races or between those deserving to be let live, and those who were born without this right. The break into the domain of life introduced by racism, the sorting between who must live and who must die, is also inscribed in the fabric of our societies by other technologies of power besides racism, such as sexism, queer and transphobia, ageism, ableism, or the distinction between us and our primeval political opponents. Even Foucault himself, when he talks of the death which those found to be by politically inferior must suffer, hastens to explain that he includes any type of symbolic death, such as political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on. The first decades of the 21st century have seen, I believe, a surge of this type of bipolitical over-determination, especially when sovereign states seem or believe themselves to be under threat, external or internal. As national discourses therefore become re-racialized and as a result, geocorporeal, the nation's antiquity and its antiquities are more and more systematically inscribed in the running of modern states across the globe as sorting mechanisms separating out the wanted from those whom the state may choose to dispose of. Now, let me also add at this point a very brief observation on which I promise to elaborate more in our meeting in Athens this January. To the schemes I have outlined above, I would add my own feeling that such appropriation and counter-appropriation strategies, in fact, constitute projects through which to negotiate and renegotiate whiteness. The concept of a generalized white identity is a rather recent one, as we all know. As a racial discourse, whiteness is designed and continuously redeployed as a tool by means of which to generate and uphold systemic racism, chronically associated with the political and cultural elites of the West. Classical studies, for one, including the appreciation and study of Greek and Roman art and Greek and Roman statues mostly, have ended up becoming emblematic of white privilege worldwide. As a result, while post-colonial struggles across the globe have often placed classical learning in a rather awkward position as a symbol of imperialism and colonization, think of the overturned statues at the beginning of my paper, at the same time, it may be deployed as a weapon of emancipation, as a means by which the colonized may reclaim their own whiteness. As it has long been argued, for example, certain ethnic groups, the most telling example among which being the Irish Americans, had in the 19th and 20th century to reclaim the racial identity as white against an entire set of racist stereotypes, perceiving them as culturally inferior and civilized, and though certainly not Black, not quite white either. For the Greek immigrants to the United States, the situation must have been similar, if not worse. Coming from a country in the periphery of Europe and one still forming part of the Ottoman Empire until the mid-19th century, if not later, Greeks found it difficult to pass as white in their new home unless they claimed the cultural and racial affiliations with Hellenism. So, whereas the Irish, for example, reclaimed their whiteness based on their Catholic ties and work ethics, the Greeks, like those in the photograph from the 4th of July parade in New York in the 1920s, had to negotiate their whiteness on the strength of their classical heritage. So here you see them parading as ancient Greeks, gods and goddesses of Olympus. This also adds a special meaning to this parade from the early 2000s, where Greek immigrants in Melbourne staged a Macedonian parade in order to claim their antiquity on the one hand and ownership of a historic land on the other. And all this in a city and a country, Australia, that insists on identifying them merely as wogs, which sounds rather non-white and certainly not historical enough. It is the insinuated link with classical whiteness and its mythologized materialities that affects the racist break and rehabilitates the marginalized or other into a body that matters. So, the new statue of Alexander and its inauguration in April 2019 must be examined under this archaeopolitical light. The mayor's decision to go ahead with this gesture at the time of the Prespa agreement came as a blatant attempt to take part in the discussion over the name, over Macedonia's future, and more importantly, over Macedonia's past, which the Greek authorities systematically claimed as the country's sole intellectual property. In doing this, Mayor Kaminis ostensibly hits back at Skopje 2014 and its frivolous display of classicizing statuary, in his turn claiming that such gestures are the privilege of the Greek authorities only. At the same time, however, Kaminis undermines the government of his own country, a government to which he is politically opposed and about to run against in the national election, in effect accusing Greece's prime minister at the time of treason by reminding everyone else of the long-gone Macedonian hero the Greek left has surrendered to the enemy. At the time, therefore, when the leaders of the opposition vowed to revoke the Prespa agreement should they win the approaching election, Alexander's statue invades the capital's public space in order to politicize it. And with it, of course, reorganize the capital's inhabitants as a population of archaeophile bodies aware of their nation's classical heritage and ready to defend it against any foreign usurper or local traitor. The new statue is used to administer to the Athenian demos its rediscovered shared classicality, which in contemporary Greece functions as an alter ego to patriotism. Athenian citizenry is then reorganized into a mass of disposable bodies happy to be made live as modern subjects to an ancient king, or if they must, happy to be let die by the long-gone conqueror general. As a political gesture, the inauguration of the statue strikes me both as old-fashioned and as post-democratic. On the one hand, it regresses to an old-school kind of public space politics that has remained unchanged since the interwar years, if not earlier. And on the other, the decision to carry out the inauguration as a political stand of sorts is post-democratic. That means to substitute state policy, turning it into an empty shell through a performance of highly politicized archaeology. The statue here is used to repurpose antiquity on behalf of a politico-economic elite who mobilizes public sentiment through a call to archaeolatric as well as pseudo-historical sentiment. Although I do not mean, of course, to suggest that Mayor of Athens at the time was a fascist or even that his politics was. His deployment of archaeopolitics as a means to sort out his city's population cannot help but bring to one's mind the systematic attempts at repurposing antiquities from the interwar years. What we witness is an attempt to govern modern populations through the bodies of the ancients, a conscious effort to map contemporary urban life based on the archaeological sentiments inscribed into the population. As with Mussolini and Franco, Alexander's statues in Athens, Thessaloniki, or Skopje are not set up as mere declarations of national sovereignty, nor do they stand as its representations alone. They are deployed as tools through which to reformulate the political, while at the same time undo the demos in the sense of when Brown is using the term. For if we accept that after an almost decade-long worldwide economic recession from 2008 to roughly 2019, followed by a global pandemic in 2020 and 2021, we have entered on international scale what has been described as the post-democracy stage in our societies. I would suggest that archaeopolitics, like biopolitics, tends to fare better under this new regime. Archaeopolitics, as a post-democratic tool in itself, is devised as a means to mobilize identity consolidations in times of uncertainty, and furthermore, to inform our imaginings of our pasts into the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dmitry, for this very rich presentation, both on the visual side and, of course, on the analysis. As we wait for questions, I think that I would like to claim moderator privilege and get the ball rolling, because there is a lot that was kind of stirred in my mind as you were giving these images, and I want to think a bit about the specific location of that statue, because that in and of itself opens us to interesting interpretations and counter narratives. Just opposite this statue is one of the few buildings in Athens where you can still visibly see the pot marks of bullets from the Dekembriana, which in the Syriza narrative of from Indignados to taking power was central in sorting Greeks into different categories as well. So it's almost as if that statue is attempting to lead the population past one sort of use of the past, more recent archaeopolitics, if you want, through the claim that it makes on space, towards another one, nostalgic perhaps of the 90s, that might have been nationalist, but at the same time before all these crises that strike us. So it's a fascinating location that we have there. As a Byzantinist, I'll ask you a question, however, that takes us a bit further back. When I look at sort of the history of the polity that we describe as Byzantium, or the medieval Roman Empire, or the succession to the Roman Empire in the East, I see similar phenomena of uses of the past and mobilizations of the past by Christians and pagans as new identities are reformulated in new emerging regimes in the Mediterranean world. And I wonder, as an archaeologist and as a student of the ancient world, how you see this modern archaeopolitical sort of work and thinking, perhaps applying to earlier periods where perhaps parallel phenomena might be taking place. What can we take from the modern theorizing into thinking about these questions in, let's say, my era? And I'm thinking about Roman laws on how, in the Christian era, on how to treat statues that were religious as cultural monuments and denude them of their sacredness. I'm thinking of Choniatis' evocation on the classical past and things like that.
Certainly. Well, we all know that it's rather shaky to try to even believe that we have always been modern, that modernity is just comes back in cycles. I think we would have to try very hard to find a truly biopolitical, or archaeopolitical, as I would call it, use of the past in the past, Rome, Byzantium, or I don't know, medieval England. Because the idea about archaeopolitics is not that it's just archaeophilia. Okay, people tend to love antiquity, to like or dislike ancient art, or classical art for that matter. But the idea that there is an embodied rationale behind our love, that the past is ours, and that it is us, it defines us, and then we have to fight for it. So if we find a Byzantine emperor or an English king or a Viking warlord, whoever, who sends their men to battle, claiming this sort of archaeological arguments, then I would be interested, and I would be willing to sit down and look at the specifics of it to decide, to determine if this is biopolitical and archaeopolitical or not. Because as an archaeologist, I am always fascinated by this Lascaris's text. This is an episode, I think, in Pergamon. And he sits there and he's overwhelmed, he's mesmerized by the ruins. But he doesn't call himself a Greek. He says, well, we are sort of Greeks. We are Greek in a sense, he says. He doesn't, and he certainly doesn't mean this about his subjects. He says, well, you know, we're ancient enough, but
yeah.
I just want to interrupt for a second and say, since John Siegel has a question there, and there are also some questions in Q&A, but I have I've put him up there to allow him to talk. Jonah, if you want, we can also you can show your face too, but it's entirely up to you. Don't want to put you on the spot, but since Jonah is actually going to join us in Athens, hopefully, I thought it would be good to allow him to introduce himself and ask the question.
Oh, sure. I don't know. Oh my goodness. I'm not sure I can show myself. I don't have that option.
I will just.
That's no loss, but I mean, either way.
No. But I think that well, now that let me make you a panelist for a moment. For whatever. Give me a second. I'm learning.
Be a lot of buildup. A very disappointing conclusion, really.
Well, actually, as it turns out, I can't do anything about it because I can't seem to. So ask your question anyway.
All right, so I'll be a disembodied voice. I'm sorry. My name is Jonas Siegel. I'm at Rutgers in English, and I'm very. I was intrigued by the presentation. I had a sort of a conceptual political question given the presentation. I'll just read what I said because it'll be quicker. I'd like to hear more about the relationship between desire and manipulation, or between politics and ideology. So I wrote down that archaeopolitics is a collective desire for the materiality of the past. So collective desire for the materiality of the past. That seems desire, or the group has a desire. Oh, cool! I've lost my question. Let's see if it'll come back. Oh, yeah, here it is. But then a lot of the instances seem to be not about a group desire, but so much as about a political manipulation by an elite. So I was just curious about the relationship of those issues in the argument. It's clear that this argument wants to be more, or is more, than about propaganda or a subset of that. So but you know, given that the instances were not like this group expressing a desire so much as a set of specific political agents trying to manipulate public opinion, I thought this might be an opportunity to kind of tease out the distinctions that the project wants to make, but that the instances might be pushing in a different direction, if that's fair to say.
No, well, the way you put it, you sound right, but my definition of archaeopolitics is not that it is a collective desire for the materialities of the past, but the assumption that there is such a thing. The pre-assumption that your public, your citizens, the members of your party, the members of your nation, love or ought to love the materialities of the past, that they have inherently, because they were born Greeks or Italians or whatever, they carry in themselves this desire for the materialities of the past, and that they ought to be ready to even sacrifice themselves for this, to honor this desire and this past. So this is what I mean by a politics that becomes archaeological. Not that it tries to invest a statue with a meaning, all statues have meanings, but the idea that your political arguments become archaeological. They are performances of excavations or of museum exhibitions or displays in the public sphere of statues and that sort of thing. So this is what I call archaeopolitics. The assumption that there is such a desire, and then the manipulation of this desire in order to affect your political gains of purposes based on the past rather than the present. And of course, this is something that other people have noticed, and For example, I remember the very well-known description of the Pergamon altar in the first pages of the novel, the Aesthetics of Resistance. I can't remember the name of the author right now, German. Where obviously he understands that this massive art had a political meaning back in antiquity, which he uses to explain how art works bipolitically in his present, which is Germany of the 1930s.
All right, thank you. That's a really helpful clarification, I think. Thanks.
Let me also, if I can jump in for a second on that, right? I mean, what's interesting is how that manipulation can also become very successful in the creation of desire, right? So I'm actually thinking of the Indian case, where, you know, all the stuff around Ayodhya and the Babri Mosque and the destruction is I mean, there are instances in Greece also, but in India right now, it's been extraordinary. And I mean, I found myself at a conversation where I was actually going to be talking about on New Jersey State Television, and I said I was doing some stuff on the reception of antiquity and archaeology, and this guy, a part of the Indian diaspora here, suddenly started talking about the Ramayana having mapped all of the world, all of the Indian world, right? And then proceeded to give a defense of Modi, right? And so it was a kind of, and in India, it's been, I think, quite successful as well in the current Hindutva moment. So in its ability to mobilize a kind of a political affect, it seems to me to have been quite something. Now, how that's working, I don't presume to know fully, but we'll be talking more about this on October 21st. Let me point.
It is working because it is a very convenient vehicle for racism, because it runs on the same line as racism. Because if you're ancient, you can't be asked to share your land with newcomers, with people who are not as ancient as you, or who are a different kind of ancient than you. So this is a problem solved. There's no way you can negotiate anything, because you are ancient, you're classical, you're Roman, you're Greek, and they're not, and that's it. So this is why it works.
So we have a question from Yael Zerubbabel. How would you compare the role of statues in the public sphere to the role of official iconography, such as the use of ancient imagery on coins, money, or festivals performed in the public sphere incorporating archeopolitical expressions?
Yes, they are comparable, and in my forthcoming book, I have included a lot of that, but I chose to speak about statues. There is a thing about statues, because if you think about it archaeologically, statues are one of the rarest find in an archaeological dig. I mean, I've been an excavator for decades, and I've never found a statue myself yet. And although none of my students, I think, have either, if you ask anyone, what it is about Greek art that they enjoy, or they think it's most important, they will start with agalmata. They will say statues. They won't say buildings, vases, coins, or inscriptions. They would go for statues. So statues, because of course they're corporeal, they're as good as living and all that, they make more sense. Now, in a long time ago, just after the Athens Olympics, I wrote a paper on the opening ceremony of that Olympiad, the 2004 opening ceremony, which is exactly this thing I'm talking about, the idea that classical Greece is a bunch of statues becoming alive, and that we are those statues. So this is archaeopolitical because it enforces more for the internal rather than external purposes. It enforces the idea of a breathing, living nation, which is as good looking as a Greek statue. Dmitry,
Sorry, yeah, I'll keep that as an argument. And I'll move to Jesse Siegel, who thanks you for this terrific presentation and is wondering if you can address the conflicts created by archaeopolitics in terms of how to use the past. In former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, there appeared to be a debate about whether the archaeological past in the form of significant ruins should be sacralized or modernized to create historical claims in the present. I'm thinking, Jesse notes in particular of Lake Ohrid, where at least in 2015, the Macedonian government was constructing a university on concrete supports over the top of ancient church ruins, sacrificing the ruins' integrity to advance the claim that it was the site of the first Slavic university.
Yeah, also I didn't have the time to go into Skopje 2014 project very much, but I should add, because it's unfair not to, that it's no more. I mean, they after the agreement with Greece, they decided to take it back. So most of those statues are now down, back again. So, but there's a notable turn in North Macedonia towards their medieval past. So which is also an archaeopolitical decision to make. So the idea was that we have to choose between different versions of our past, which is nationalism 101. You have to write down a coherent, linear historical narrative for your nation. So in the beginning, they tried to be like Greece, so to go back to antiquity and take it from there. And as you know, in Greece, the problem is always Byzantium. We don't really know what to do with it. Parigopoulos had a good idea, so this is what we're doing still, all those decades after him. But I think the Northern Macedonians decided to bet on their Byzantine sort of medieval past rather than try to claim Macedonianness going back to antiquity, simply because they don't have the archaeology, meaning that they don't have the sites. So because this is I think crucial for this sort of argument, the idea that if the land where everything happened is in your nation state now, then you can lay claim to it. If it's not, it's a problem. So this would explain Ohrid, I would think, and this would explain why the Greek state is not really interested in what's going on in Byzantium and Thessaloniki in terms of archaeology.
Yeah.
So they're happy to get rid of it or redo it in a sort of fake version, because they're not really interested in it.
Yeah, because it doesn't fit the Paparigopoulian continuity with its Romanness.
It's not crucial for the Hellenic narrative, so it can go.
But what you discuss about the embeddedness of monuments in space raises questions of autochthony that then can be connected directly to the racist lineages that you want to discuss. This is. Irini, you want to ask your question? I should not be reading your words.
I didn't want to interrupt. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask if you could please comment on the female figures and statues in the imagined Greek past. If something can be said, particularly in Athens, or do we have any examples, or what is the gender dimension of archaeopolitics as it is in place, manifested in the capital of Greece?
You mean statues of ancient Greek women?
Yes.
Were there any? I mean, as
Exactly.
usually say to my students, ancient Greeks were all men. There were no women in ancient Greece, obviously. Well, there are few. There are a few. There are some personifications. I think there's an Alantica bust of a woman that I think needs to be Athens or the Acropolis itself, something like that. She's wearing the Acropolis on her head, repeatedly vandalized because it's in a really bad spot. There's a statue of Aspasia for some reason, I think mostly because she was Pericles' wife. I can't think of any other women. There's a Pericles, there's a Theseus, there's an Icarus, you know, most of the full-bodied statues in Athens right now are those of men. So you have many Venizeluses, Trikoupises, even Atiligianis, Makrigianis, and all these. You have a few female busts, obviously. Aliki Vouliouklaki, Papayani, who was executed, but not a full. I don't think there's any.
Which again is an insightful observation in terms of how it's a male imagined or presented past and deployed, if you like, in the capital of Athens.
In a way, this is the past we have inherited. The question with this is that whether we need to edit, as I said in the very beginning, we need to edit this past. Whether we should be satisfied with that, or we'll say, oh, it's okay. Well, the Greeks were a patriarchal society. What can you do? That's it. You have all those men sitting around writing their books. So this is what we can live with. We have to live with. But if we decide that we need to edit this past and we need to edit this art, classical or neoclassical, then we need to sit down and do some real work. And Mr. Papas and the late Papas and Alexander statue and Mr. Kaminis, you know, are a rather an odd tune in this discussion.
I want to say something which I find also very interesting, right? So the first time I went as an adult to Greece, I mean, I should say that as a child, I was taken with my parents to Athens, Prague, and Rome, Donetsk. I mean, so there we were, based in Singapore, and that's what we did. But and I still remember having nightmares because we went to the Acropolis, and then we were told about the birth of Athena coming out of the head, right? And for years I had this nightmare about it, right? Because it was just terrifying to me, this like head bursting open and a person coming out. But that's a different story. I think I might start my current book with that story. But then I come back, thanks to Dmitry Kralis's invitation to teach in the Hellenic Studies program, right? And I had no interest in ruins at all. I had no interest whatsoever. But I wanted to, you know, go teach somewhere else. So we went, and we were in Kefalonia. I think we started at Kefalonia, rather. And I remember that there was a guy who ran the kiosk in the port town. Remember, Dmitry? And, you know, we were, and he was going to give us, and Ithaca was nearby, I think. And so he was going to give us a tour of everywhere that Odysseus stepped, right? And this is so ubiquitous as an experience in Greece, right? Where, speaking of it, the imagination of the nation, right? Where people are constantly, you know, on the streets. This is, and also partly addressed to Juno, right? I mean, the kind of a capacity to get mobilized by this, right? So you know, he was going to give me a tour. Then we're in Delphi. I'm in Delphi with a field school, another field school, and I'm given a lecture. The tour guide is giving a lecture about how this was the navel of the world and the center of the world, and even the professor leading the lecture has no problem with it, right? And I say something about Martin Bernal, just thinking that this person was radical. And like nobody is going to talk to me after that. Like literally all of these professors, right, including these supposedly radical ones, like literally formed this kind of huddle against me, and I'm outside it. And it was a revelation for me, because I actually thought this was all, like, come on, these are, progressive people and liberals at least, right? That they can't possibly have an investment. And so over and over again, right, I come up against this in Greece and have it over the past 13 years. And then one example was when I was in Crete, and I just walked into a leather shop, right? And this guy says to me, "You can't be Greek." And I said, "Okay." I mean, not trying, but okay. And he started talking about his DNA, how it's in the DNA, right? So and then about ancient Greece again, right? So what's really interesting to me is in a place like Greece is how deeply it permeates the imagination, right? That's kind of what's striking. But I have a counterexample too. And that is, and maybe it's not a counterexample, maybe it is what you're calling, maybe this is an effect of what you call the Archeopolitics mentality, right? Which is that it's so internalized, this notion that antiquity will decide for us, right? That in Pakistan, for instance, in the northern parts, a kind of relationship with Buddhist antiquity, Indo-Greek, right, and Bactrian, is then used to push up against the Muslim nationalism of the state, right? Look, that we have a broader history. So it also becomes a space of contestation. And it's one of the things that explains the destruction of the Bamiyan statues, the Daesh destructions in Syria, because there's the kind of secular nationalists claim these irreligious, so to speak, or non-Abrahamic histories as their own, right? And so then the Islamists come and destroy those because they're associated with the secular nationalists. So in the Middle East, this has been one of the contestations. So I don't know how you would think of that in relation to what you're saying, right? Because these are contestatory politics of the nation.
Oh, this is why they're devised to be a field of discontent, to be a field of conflict, and this is why they're deployed. This is why they're put there. Although it seems to me that Greece is rather alone right now to be maintaining this sort of thinking in its neighborhood. I don't think this is as strong in Italy as it used to be.
No, it isn't.
Perhaps it never was. You get it in other parts of our area. You get in Bulgaria, perhaps. You used to get it in North Macedonia. You get in Albania sometimes. But I think you would have to try hard to find a sort of interwar politics so deeply embedded in Greek Greek imaginings of ourselves right now. Now, when you come to places like Syria and the Muslim conflicts and of course the Taliban and everything, there you have different factors at play, because there is this sort of quasi-religious distrust of art anyway. So this is a factor that we don't really get in our parts of the world as much. It is used, though. It is used in the archeopolitical rhetoric of Greece. The idea that refugees from Syria or from other parts of the Muslim world are coming here to destroy our churches. So this is a sort of interesting argument you get, and you do get it, and most people in the city believe that.
I mean, to follow on Saria's comment, I think that perhaps because of the fetishization of the ancient past in school books that we basically get shoved down our throats from day one at school all the way to graduation and beyond. There is kind of a, if you want, an archaeological vernacular, however badly sort of digested, where people will either walk you around places in imaginary fashion by mobilizing whatever they've heard and they've been living in. So there is a discourse, even if it can be uninformed, and in that way, the ground is really well set up for also campaigns of shaping the discourse, because people are ready to play by those rules. I had a meeting yesterday with two young artists, writers who participated in the creation of a Greek graphic novel on Byzantine history. Theophanoi has come out, and they went to present their work at a Comic-Con event, and it was really fascinating because the moment they appeared with Byzantium in Comic-Con, which tends to have a bit of a certain audience that is more left, etc., immediately they were branded as either right-wing or religious, even though what they were trying to do is to disrupt the Paparigopoulos narrative of continuity through the novel and think of this Roman identity. So we are predisposed through our digestion of all this fetishized past, and then of course on how we canalize it on the basis of our own political stances, to really work with this past as in fairly intricate, not necessarily informed ways. And then of course, when you dump into that an organized narrative, we have ways of plugging into that and connecting. It's fascinating.
So what you're saying is, I mean, just to follow up, and then I think if there's one more question, we can take it. Otherwise, we should end soon. Is that, so when you say Dmitry Splanzos, that it's designed that way, right? I mean, I want to push a little here, right? Because are you saying that it's designed when there's contestation, that the story is designed to manage conflict in that way, or is that an unintended consequence? Because it sounds to me that Dmitry Splanzos is saying that it's so well programmed that, sort of it's so kind of shaping up the discursive field and the imagination. Say, let's just stick with the Greek example because it's a neat example, it's right? That even contestation happens within those parameters, right? But you're saying something else, which I don't know if I fully buy. I mean, I like it, but it's like that it's designed that it's not. Is it designed to elicit that conflict, or is it just that once it's in, that the instantiation is so of this regime of what is essentially also the imagination is so expansive that it also ends up that contestation has to be on those terms, because that's what's being contested. Do you see the distinction I'm trying to make here?
Yeah, I see what you're talking about. I believe that, yes, of course, there's this amazing landscape of classical desire around us, which we have been cultivating for so long through our museums and our school books, and as Dimitris just said. But then when you're trying to make an argument, you don't necessarily, as a modern politician, I mean, like the mayor of Athens, who's running a national election, you don't really need to go back to Alexander the Great. When you're trying to nationalize Thessaloniki against the 19th century threat, why do you have to go back to Alexander the Great? I mean, neither Philip nor Alexander ever saw Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki was founded after their death. They never went there. The Athenians had a party when Alexander died. they were so happy he was gone, and they revolted against the Macedonian army the day after. I mean, why on earth would anyone think that Athens needs yet another statue, and actually a statue of Alexander? And it was done. Kamenius was waiting 8 years in his office, and he did it 2 weeks just before he left the mayorship. And he just did it for modern, present-day political purposes. So this is what I mean by design. It's there, of course it's there in the books. He did not invent Alexander, but he did invent an anti-Syriza Alexander that day. And that was an argument. And it was like, you know, a nod to the voters who were going to vote against Syriza within the space of a few weeks. Because regardless what the government at the time was claiming and was arguing, the vast majority of Greeks was against the treaty and the agreement with North Macedonia, and they insisted that the name should be unchanged, that they shouldn't be called Macedonia or anything like that. So this is what I mean by design. You have this repertoire, this toolkit, and it just lies there. But then it comes a time when you use it, and it's very, very effective.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to what will follow in our coming events, and to how we pick up the thread and take it further. I want to thank our panelists and our audience for their questions and participation. And I'll pass it on to Sadia for perhaps a final word on where we go next before we wrap up for tonight. Thank you again, Dmitry.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Dmitry, for both the Dmitrys. You know, it's going to be even more interesting in Athens because there'll be 3 Dmitrys there. So it's going to be, we need to come up with some affectionate or mocking diminutives here. I mean, so, but in any case, I mean, they'll become mocking over time, I think. But it was a wonderful talk and a great inaugural lecture for our collaboration. Also delighted that we got a nice audience for the first CES event. And stay tuned, everybody, for our next event, which is an Afghanistan roundtable on the 20th of September, but then also, and there'll be more events that are CES related, but we will also have our next Archeopolitics and Colonialism and Interwar Europe event on October 21st, where we will be extending this conversation to colonial Britain, Greece, and colonial India and British colonialism, Poland, and so the Soviet Union, and India, Modi's India now. Tamara Sears will be speaking, so will Jan Kubik, and I will be presenting from my current research on Curzon. Thank you, everyone, for being here.